Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, the supply chain disruptions have dominated news cycles in the United States. But how responsible is the government in managing the supply chain? Is this pandemic driven, or are there larger issues of global supply and production models? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. Over the last few months, we've seen numerous news reports about supply chain disruptions with predictions of product shortages in key areas throughout the United States. Here in Los Angeles, where we record, we regularly hear of dozens of ships waiting to dock in the Los Angeles and Long Beach harbors to unload their goods. This challenge has compelled conversations about economic globalization and the nature of supply in the current production models, such as the so-called just-in-time production. On today's show, we will examine the nature of this supply chain challenge and ask whether this is a new feature of the global economy or a relatively temporary challenge resulting largely from the pandemic. Our panel today is Christopher Tang, Distinguished Professor and Edward W. Carter Chair in Business Administration and Senior Associate Dean of Global Initiatives at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's the co-author of Supply Chain Risk Management and the co-editor of Operations Management Models with Consumer-Driven Demand. Eleftherios Iakovou is the Harvey Hubble Professor of Industrial Distribution at Texas A&M University and the Director of Manufacturing and Logistics Innovation Initiatives at Texas A&M Engineering Experiment Station. He is the co-author of Sustainable Supply Chain Management in the Digitalization Era, the Impact of Automated Guided Vehicles, and with Chelsea White, the co-author of How to Build a More Secure, Resilient, Next-Generation U.S. Supply Chain. And Chelsea White, the Schneider National Chair in Transportation and Logistics and Professor at the H. Milton Stewart School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech. He's the co-author of Mobile Access Hub Deployment for Urban Parcel Logistics, and of course, the piece previously referenced. So thank you all very much for joining us. Christopher Tang, let's start with you. What is this supply chain challenge, supply chain disruption? What's going on?
Doug, thank you very much for having me. Before I answer your question, maybe I spend 2 minutes to explain what supply chain is first. Now, well, when supply is plentiful, supply chains are invisible to most people, even though they are omnipresent. Everything you use, everything you touch, you eat, you drink, you see, you listen, involve some supply chain operations. Now, but when there are shortages, then everyone will see there are supply chain problems. Now, if you think about supply chain, it's really a network that's starting from the raw material suppliers, such as a farmer who raises a turkey. And then they transport the turkey to the semi-finished supplier, that would be the slaughterhouse. And after that, they ship the turkey to the meat packing plant. So that would be the manufacturing sites. That could be like Tyson or Purdue Chicken and all this. And then after that, they send it to distribution centers and then to the supermarkets and to consumers. Now, from the perspective of supply chains, for the consumers, they look at supply chain is the price, what is available. That's what consumers care about. But for the manufacturers or the retailers, they care about, do I have the right products at the right time, at the right cost for the customers? Right now, we are seeing a lot of supply chain disruptions, mainly because we feel that there is a shortage. But this is created for two reasons. One is a demand surge. During the lockdown and last year, people stay at home. They may buy more furniture, office equipment, work from home, and home appliances and all this. So the demand actually surged by 30% year to year because of the assistance from the government, and people have more money to spend, but they cannot go out to travel to hotel and in the services. So instead of spending money on services, they spend money on durable goods. So that's why trigger the demand surge. At the same time, there is a supply issue, especially in Asia, in other developed countries. They do not have supply of vaccines. They're limited. So as a result, the factories in Vietnam may be subject to lockdown. China, because it's a zero COVID policies, then the ports sometimes could be partial closure and also quarantine. So as a result, it will actually lengthen what we call the lead time. It takes longer for them to ship the products. Now, because of the volume is so huge, by the time they come to the West Coast, in particular, would be like Long Beach, Los Angeles ports, Seattle, and Tacoma. They cannot handle the volume. So that's why all the containers, they're stuck at the terminal. And then in terms of the ship, they're waiting to unload the containers. Right now, as of today, there are 46 ships anchored just outside of the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles. But there are 50 of them. They are parked 15 to 20 miles outside in the Pacific Ocean. So actually, we still have 100 ships waiting to unload. But there are many reasons we can come back to discuss further. I stop here.
And Eleftherios, I've heard that part of the challenge here is the docks themselves, the port itself, and part of it is the ability to transport goods out of the port. Is this really fundamentally a ground transportation problem, a sea transportation problem? How are they related to one another?
Doug, thank you for the invitation again, and it's an honor being with such esteemed colleagues here. Unfortunately, as much as we would like, the answer is not short. If I can add back to what Dr. Tang said, COVID really exacerbated and brought into the surface structural problems of these globalized supply chains that we built and we experienced in everyday life following the inclusion of China in the World Trade Organization with our support, of the United States support, as a preferred trading partner, leading to 480 billion surplus from the Chinese side and migration of millions of jobs offshore. So the private sector, I use a phrase, re-engineered the balance sheet as opposed to the supply chain. Financialization that we're experiencing today across our great country has really had an impact on supply chains. So supply chains focused on minimizing total cost. And guess what? The corporate guys, the private guys are outstanding, right? They have the technology, they have the means, they have the skills, the human capital to do great stuff. And that great stuff really allowed you and I and Chip to consume products at low cost. The ability of critical supply chain stakeholders, such as ports, Doug, has been left behind. I use the term, the cycle times, the clock times of the private folks is much faster as opposed to the ability of private ports that are usually overseen by state or local authorities with container terminals being privatized, but still they don't have the capabilities to embed themselves properly into 1,000 globalized supply chains that go through them. So I give you an example. People talk about tracking, right, being a bottleneck. I respectfully have some disagreements there. What happens when a truck driver has a web-based appointment with a port? He or she goes there and the port doesn't honor the appointment. And the truck driver just clocked 14 hours. As per federal mandates, he or she has to go back and rest. What happens with the IT systems that the ports offer for these appointments? And it happened in California again and again during the last few months. They don't function. What happens when I take a chassis with a trailer, with a container, go to the port, but the port tells me, you know what? It's not the right type of container. You have to go back. Right? So we create impediments that would have been avoided if we don't blast each other, if we don't demonize the private and the public, but rather work together. And my thesis here is very simple. We are at an inflection point. COVID provides not only pain, human suffering and challenges, but provides a unique opportunity for us as a nation, as a beacon of democratic capitalism, to reinvent how we run trade and how we can position ourselves in this new global order that it will be based on supply chains that are morphed under countries that obey a rules-based mindset. So harmonization of all these entities across what we call end-to-end supply chain is more important than ever. And we need the feds, right? We need to revisit, allow me to use a 60s term, a moonshot initiative. A moonshot initiative that will say, you know what, let's go and compete with autocracies, fair and square, by bringing the best of the public, the private, creating partnerships along with academia.
And so, Chip White, it sounds like at least part of this narrative is that the pandemic exposed what already were weaknesses in a production model that existed prior to the pandemic. I mean, is that fair, that it's exposing the areas that the system was already weak before, but the pandemic's just made it a lot worse?
Actually, that weakness, Doug, may be considered a strength. Let me comment about why did supply chains develop globally in the first place. And both Chris and Eleftherios have pointed the finger towards cost. Cost is a major determinant of consumer purchases. Less expensive, it's been less expensive to make it offshore and transport it over a longer distance than to make it domestically and transport it a relatively short distance. The longer the distance, the transport, the more risk, I think Chris would agree with this, you take, but risk has been somewhat neglected. And why is that true? Well, certain innovations like the container trade agreements have been key to allowing supply chains to grow globally, and of course, cheap offshore labor. If cost is the major driver, then supply chains are going to be motivated to take as much cost out of supply chains as possible, which means lean down your manufacturing capacity, your transport capacity, your inventories. And this goes to your just-in-time comment. So the objective becomes minimizing excessive manufacturing capacity, transport capacity, and inventory, which produces a lean supply chain. And now we come to the weakness. Is there a downside? Yes. Lean supply chains don't react well to disruptions. They simply don't have the capacity to surge when needed. And resilience is needed in supply chains if there's a lot of variability. And resilience usually equates to buffer manufacturing capacity, transportation capacity, and buffer inventory. So there is a trade-off between minimizing total supply chain cost and minimizing total supply chain disruption risk. And this will be a good sort of launching point for discussion about rising prices and how inflation is being affected by the pandemic. Now, actually, Chris, I thought did a very good job of describing why the pandemic has caused supply chain disruptions, moving from services into purchases of goods, particularly durable goods have been a major cause. We've had shifts in demand from medical supplies to and significant drops in demand in, say, auto in the first 3 months of the pandemic. And this usually requires supply and manufacturing to adjust rapidly. But if you don't have a supplier base and a manufacturing base that has the resilience built into it, because we've taken cost out of it, then it can't react very easily. It doesn't work very well. And so what COVID has done is affected the ability of the supply side and the manufacturing side to rapidly adjust. With respect to your comment about what's the cause of this, it's just not boats on the water at anchor. By the way, we're seeing the same kind of buildup of container ships outside of Savannah, which is also a big container port in the United States. But it's an overall systemic global logistics challenge, as Eleftherios mentioned. We have chassis that aren't in the right place, trailers, rail flows, congestion in virtually all the modes, limited transportation warehousing flexibility. And as Chris said, we've seen these lengthened lead times, and lead time is fundamentally related to the ability to be resilient in a supply chain. If we can reduce lead times, then we increase agility in supply chains and also reliability. So those are some of the comments that I have. By the way, with respect to lean supply chains and the just-in-time, that usually traces back to the Toyota production system. It's remarkable to note that Toyota was one of the major automakers that did not feel the impact of the semiconductor crisis as much as other auto manufacturers did. They're very smart when it comes to knowing when to be lean and when not to be lean. So we need to take that into consideration as well.
So you're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the supply chain challenges and disruptions with Christopher Tang of UCLA, Eleftherios Iakovou of Texas A&M, and Chip White of Georgia Tech University. Chris Tang, you had a response to what Chip was saying there.
Well, I want to point out that there are two systemic problems in the port of Los Angeles. That is something the government and the private companies need to rethink. First of all, at the ports, relative to other countries, you'll be surprised. Relative to Asia, the ports in Asia like Singapore, China, and Rotterdam, we're way behind in terms of automation. All right. Why is that? Because we have unions. The unions do not want automation. Thus, there's a conflict. So how do you overcome that hurdle? I don't know. That's systemic problem number one. Systemic problem number two, as Eleftherios was talked about in terms of the container and the chassis. Now, private companies, they have a very smart, clever way to secure their revenues. If you ship your container from, let's say, Maersk, you have to use Maersk container. And not just a container. Sometimes even the chassis is specifically designed for that container. So they're not universal. Just like when we travel around the world, we bring so many different different sockets, right? Same idea. So they're not interchangeable. Now, this really impedes the supply chain efficiency. But on the other hand, there's no incentive to change because right now, actually, the shipping company, they're making record-breaking profits. Maersk has made so much profits, it actually has broken the Danish history profits making. So I think that is also related to the systemic problem. Is it something the government need to regulate? Is it something that the government need to work with the union to create a better infrastructure in the United States?
Eleftherios, you had a response as well.
If you allow me, I want to go back just for a sec. You know, the ancient Greeks masters spoke about hubris. Hubris is when we become so arrogant where we insult the gods and the nemesis comes, right? And the punishment comes. So I think we attained hubris with globalized supply chains, Doug, and we pretended for a long time that we can run them as deterministic networks, right? That everything will come from origin to destination exactly as the prescribed time, the lead times that Dr. Tang and Chip White spoke about. The market had recognized that. So I'll give you just only three numbers. Global GDP raised from 39% to 58% in 2019. In 1990, it was 39%, right? Global trade as percent of global GDP. It went up to 61% in 2008, financial crisis, right? After that time, before COVID, we start witnessing a reduction of the supply chains. These companies had already recognized that these supply chains were too lengthy, thus they were too brittle, too exposed to risks that Tang and White spoke about. And as a result, the global trade in 2019, just before the plague hit us, it had shrunk from 61% to 58% of global GDP. So the people talk about globalization, the economist term by a Dutch technocrat, or deglobalization. There's some inherent terms, right, that we need to make adjustments to the system. That's human history over long, lengthy cycles. Chip mentioned absolutely resilience, cost money, Doug. So somebody has to absorb the cost, right? The challenge is when and the cost don't have to do just with safety stocks. That's for the three of us here, it's common knowledge, but for the outsider listener, it's not just the additional inventories that I gotta maintain in case something goes bad. Chip mentioned Toyota, right? Toyota, after the Fukushima event in 2011, they learned the lesson and they had stocked semiconductor chips for 6 months. But starting this November, they already start having themselves some issues. The resilience also has to do with where I'm sourcing from. Do I have only one supplier, and most of the multinationals went to that game, or do I diversify? Do I hedge against risk by having one German, one Vietnamese, one Chinese, and one Mexican supplier? So that's the way to go there, but somebody has to pay for it. And the challenge becomes intense when I have to compete, allow me to say here, with state-owned enterprises of China that for which cost is not an issue. And we can talk about it later, right? So the aggressive mercantilism that supports that. And my last comment also is about Dr. Tang's great point about ports. Ports in the US, not only the longshoremen are unionized circa 1950s, they really didn't automate, and they really didn't embrace simple practices that are so prevalent across the European Union, such as hinterland container terminals. Right? Only today, during the crisis, we started scrabbling around and said, oh, you know what? We're going to put another container in somewhere inland, outside of inland towards Salt Lake City, so we can connect with rail the two California ports, so we have more effective capacity, right? Why didn't we start planning about these things, emulating best practice of others? And just for the discussion, with these two great colleagues, in the article that we wrote with Chip at Brookings that got some significant attention, we discussed the issue of this, how can we develop cost competitive resilience? And there we spoke also a little bit about robustness. Robustness is a little different. And the difference has to do, allow me an analogy between oak and a reed. The oak is very strong, is robust, right? It's gonna fight the wind, but it will fall down under severe conditions. The reed yields. The reed has the flexibility to bounce back. And I think that's what we're talking about. We want the supply chains to have the reed capabilities to yield a little bit, increase slightly cost competitive resilience, we talk with Chip, but bounce back as quickly as possible and potentially even at a better position than before, creating opportunities. And when it does that, when the reed acts like that, Doug, it can assist both our national security and our economic security. And we live in an era now that more and more of informed citizens across the aisle understand that national and economic security are becoming intimately interwoven.
And Chip, I was thinking that when you're talking about sort of cost versus resilience, one thing the pandemic revealed is that there's definitely certain items where resilience is even more important than others. I think of immediately the concerns about access to PPE and how that got exposed in the early days of the pandemic. We just didn't have enough of that. How much of that conversation is taking place now? That, I mean, obviously cost is always going to be a concern, but maybe there's certain items where we should emphasize resilience over cost.
Absolutely. And they have to do with security, either healthcare security, economic security, or military security. This is a role for a more of a top-down approach to dealing with these problems when we really need a government, when just the decentralized approach that Chris mentioned earlier just doesn't work as well. And how to develop those public-private partnerships so that there is a coordination between the public side and the private side is a real challenge right now. We're seeing a lot of discussion and effort to talk about it, but we're not seeing a real smooth, approach to that. One thing I'd like to do is also go back to something Chris talked about. He talked about standardization, which we could have certainly more of it. Those 10-meter containers, 53-foot containers just don't, they get loaded in China, by the way, but they can't go on the roads over there. Different size and weight regulations all over the world, different hours of service. Now, going back to what Chris said about automation, absolutely. If you go to Singapore, that wonderful 30 million TEU port in Singapore, which they are expanding to a 65 million TEU port now. The drayage vehicles on the port are all automated. The warehouses are automated. You see this in Rotterdam and some other places in China as well. And by the way, automation would really help also inland in terms of moving goods around. For example, we would have a tremendous amount of buffer of truck capacity if we didn't have hours of service. The trucks themselves, the power units and the trailers and the chassis don't have hours of service regulations. It's the drivers. And if you take the drivers out and replace them with automation, the automation wouldn't have hours of service regulation. You get a tremendous impact in terms of productivity of your trucking industry if you saw that, as well as anything that involves moving goods around at a port and inland. So those are some comments that I think coincide with some of the comments that Chris made.
Yeah, and Chris, you want to respond as well?
Well, thank you. I think that, Chelsea and Eleftherios, they have really great comments. Now, but I think that if we were trying to resolve this problem, and I think the government need to rethink about how they manage the supply chain. What was unearthed is that this information is not there. No one knows what is happening. Even the government does not know how many containers are there, how many are empty, which way are they going. So until last month in November, so the Biden administration actually asked Pete Buttigieg to develop a national supply chain dashboard to keep track of the information at the terminal, at the warehouse, at the store. But I've written an article about that. The information is looking at the review mirror. They update it every 2 weeks. I said, that's useless. Unless your real-time information, then you can coordinate. So right now would be like the ports and the trucking operators and the warehouse operators, they need to work together to coordinate such that they can do a synchronous dance, like those Greek folk dance. It will really synchronous. So in the case, it will get the supply chain moving. That's point number one. Point number two is yes, during the COVID, we also discover the national stockpile will not work. No matter you're talking about a safety stock, you never can predict a huge tsunami coming, right? So I wrote an article and published in the Sloan Management Review at MIT. We proposed a different structure. And this one, actually, we sent it to the US Senate subcommittee to consider. So the one is that you need national stockpile because you can respond to the immediate need within 12 hours. That's what they do. But then, as Eleftherios also pointed out, maybe we need to, so for certain critical items, we need to have some nearshoring capacity. Some, not all, because the others still cheaper overseas. So like a portfolio supplier. So you can reserve that kind of capacity just in case you need it, then you can execute it. But then the third one is using new technology. That means a new technology, for example, would be like 3D printing. So 3D printing capabilities would be like you can have develop the file to produce certain things. In normal times, you can produce some other products. In emergencies, you can just download the file. You can print a face shield. You can print other items, right? So therefore, in that case, it's a backup capacity as well. So that could be in addition to the portfolio of suppliers that Eleftherios talk about. I think this is also a multiple tier of response that to the emergencies. So I think these two can can address some of the issues.
Chip, kind of want to focus this next part on the ability of the government to try to manage some of these challenges. Certainly in the United States, there's a real aversion to the idea of the government intervening too much into these market approaches and the additional costs that might entail. What's the challenge of asking the government? It certainly seems to be these directions towards the Biden administration that you need to do something about the supply chain problem. Is this opening the door to much more government management of these supply issues?
Well, I think there's a place for government management in crises. And there certainly is a place. I mean, for example, and Chris will probably agree with this one, there are two times when you really need good management. When you're in a crisis to get out of it, and when you're not in a crisis to stay out of it, right? And so there really is a reason to be able to perhaps develop a more of a coordinated, maybe top-down approach during crises, and I think that's certainly important. In terms of 3D printing, by the way, 3D printing or printers are very versatile. They can change designs, they can make things differently, and so they're very adaptable. As a matter of fact, Toyota likes its suppliers to have simple designs. They require their suppliers to actually do the design work to keep them up to speed with current design applications and so forth. So that if all of a sudden the P-valve factory burns up, that the P-valve is simple enough for the radiator companies to actually readjust in a couple of days and make those P-valves for Toyota. And the 3D printers are additive manufacturing in general is just perfect for that. There's another advantage to 3D printers. The manufacturing capacity is portable by and large. Many of them are portable, which gives another dimension in terms of how you can relocate and readjust your supply chains to make them more agile, to reduce those lead times that automatically produce a more agile and resilient product. So we'll put that down on the list of things with automation also and standardization as next generation supply chain ideas that we are really seeing happening now in the private sector. I think Eleftherios mentioned just the increase the number of suppliers so that you have this flexibility to change your suppliers, and by the way, General Motors does this already. They have a cheap, inexpensive supplier in Southeast Asia, China, and a more expensive one in domestically, so that they don't run into a choke point like a border crossing. With a supply chain, if there is a disruption, these are currently standard practices that can occur, but if you want to lean down your supply chain as much as possible, what you do is put as much of the burden of production offshore and not have the resilience onshore that you really need, going back to Chris's point.
The implications of that when it control cost, but the impact that has on resilience. Chris, you got a response?
Well, I was going to comment about the role of governments in the supply chain. Well, I think throughout the history, no US president has paid so much attention to supply chain. No one. And this is really a golden opportunity for our community to do that. So I had the privilege to meet with the US Senate subcommittee. We talk about these issues, but then I asked them exactly who is in charge. Because the Biden administration, they commissioned a review in terms of how to build back better in terms of a secure supply chain. And actually, they don't know. I said, is it FEMA? Is it Department of Commerce? Is it National Security? Who? And I said that also who is going to line up all the ducks? Actually, they do not know. The reason is that they do not have the expertise in the White House. Because this is really need to rethink how the government can coordinate. So right now, the government only focus on regulations, which they're good at. But in terms of rebuilding something that we've lost and how to engage the private sectors. So I've said in meetings between the government and the private sectors, the government always come with regulations because they're lawyers, even right now in the Congress. And then the private companies such as Intel, HP said, look, you have never worked in a business in their entire life. How do you know what kind of challenge I'm facing? So in that case, it's really not, they're not talking. So I think that is something we need to rethink. How does the government can engage private companies and engage the university like what we used to do? Because bear in mind, in terms of the creation of semiconductor and the creation of internet, they were in collaboration between the government, private sectors, and the universities. I think that it's time for us to rethink how we can get everyone on the same boat, on the same page to get the supply chain moving.
Eleftherios, this really makes me think the way the US and the US government's relationship with the supply chains, very different than other countries, and one that you've specifically highlighted is China's, of course. I mean, generally speaking, this is really a large question about the role of government in the economy. And as Chris points out, one of the reasons why we've had a lack of faith in that is the US government hasn't shown any acumen in managing this. So how do we overcome this challenge?
Great points raised by both Chip and Chris. I was on a call with a gentleman who advises the secretary in Washington, D.C., and he admitted that we don't have a supply chain management playbook. His main reason was, you know what, supply chain is not taught in policymaking schools. So to Chris's point, we got to fill a void. So the government, Chris nailed it, right? The government, Doug, confuses supply chain with transportation and supply chain with logistics. Logistics is a subset of the supply chain. In the supply chain, we plan all over the world. We plan in the United States, in Cupertino. We buy all over the world. We make, we move, we distribute, we sell, and then we run also returns, the reverse logistics. That is not commonly understood. And within these supply chains, that we have to manage not just products, but flows of information that Chris spoke about, flows of cash, God forbid, people have to make money, and flows of workflows, right? So the government has an issue there. And to Chris's point, I witnessed it again and again when you bring the private folks to talk to governmental folks, the private folks look at government with a fear of black ops. Here they are, they're going to strangle us with regulation. At the same time, the well-meaning, all of them are well-meaning. I don't doubt that. The feds or the federal agencies look at the private sector suspiciously, recognizing though the increased capabilities. So that's the reason, and I second what Chris suggested. That's the reason I speak about moonshot initiative. So the fact that I have these things here on my touch phone, Doug, is because of inventions of support of DARPA, right? The touch screen. The reason I was able to get the Moderna shots is because of DARPA. Let's not forget that. So the invisible hand of Adam Smith will work only in the US. God bless, and we're going to support that. But at the same time, a catalytic intervention of educated federal agencies will add value. But you know the problem that we have, financialization. We have broke down capabilities within the federal government as we wanted to reduce cost. So now is a unique opportunity for honest brokers such as willing and able academicians to add value there. But the critique also that I'm making to my craft, Doug, is the majority of the very smart men and women who work in the field have really distorted the message of what we call supply chain management. When supply chain management was brought in the 90s, it had an end-to-end from upstream, from the moment I source, up to delivery, right? An end-to-end paradigm. Now we have extremely smart men and women who they do last mile logistics, let's say, which is the ability to respond Amazon type from a local distribution center. And they call supply chain management just that. We got to go back to that end to end, and that's very difficult. And in this end to end, and Chris and Chip mentioned that, to develop these resilient supply chains, government and private, we gotta have visibility of the supply chain. Chris mentioned that, right? I gotta know where my container is. I do not know now. Only then I could do remedial action. And companies, since they outsource so extensively, they figure out during COVID, and this is not the right time to do that they cannot map the supply chains. Supply chain mapping is the ability to understand who are the suppliers of my suppliers and who are the customers of my customers. In 2011, when the Fukushima tsunami and all the great upheaval occurred, a huge global semiconductor company assigned 100 executives to conduct this exercise to identify tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. Doug, it took them 1 calendar year to assess that.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing supply chain disruptions and challenges to the supply chain with Chris Tang of UCLA, Eleftherios Iakovou of Texas A&M, and Chip White of Georgia Tech. Chip, we've identified these challenges here in the US. Is this something that's more global? Is the US the only country that's experiencing these supply chain disruptions? Are we starting to see this more globally, especially considering that the pandemic certainly seemed to be the trigger here?
Well, I think we're seeing disruptions everywhere, but we're seeing responses to the disruptions in different ways. For example, I think most of the major ports in the People's Republic of China, mainland China, are 24/7. That's because of the ability to provide top-down leadership. You see the same thing in Singapore. Very, not only good leadership, but good fellowship. This is something that we sometimes are challenged with in the United States. All of the comments that Chris made about, what we need in terms of, a structure of dealing with problems and crises, I fully support. And we're seeing these kinds of discussions now, in Senate hearings. And we're seeing efforts on the part of the new administration to put together task forces. Chris mentioned one that was put together several months ago as the Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force. It's focused on dealing with today's problems rather than, what are we going to be doing in the future? How are we going to put together a process where we have the kind of governance that we need and also the expertise we need to make sure these crises are modulated, at least in the future. Sometimes actually we're seeing some of it working. Sort of interestingly, we abnormally high ships at anchor in LA, Long Beach, and Savannah, New York, New Jersey. We're seeing significantly greater costs for container shipments. What a container shipment from Singapore to LA, Long Beach was $1,200, $1,500. This is for a TEU, 20-foot equivalent unit. Just a few years ago, maybe even months ago, now it's 10 times that. And this is, the private sector reacting as it does to supply and demand. But we're also seeing an increase in imported loaded containers this year relative to years in the past. So we're actually getting more containers, loaded containers through LA Long Beach than we have in the past, Chris. That's kind of an interesting statistic. We're also seeing an increase in inflation-adjusted retail inventories. We have plenty of stuff on, in our stores and everything. The demand is just overwhelming too, and it admittedly is mixed. And so we're seeing retail stores, keeping goods in stock at near pre-COVID levels. So the supply chain is kind of working, but perhaps not perfectly. And not reacting as well as it could if it were agile and resilient to the increase in customer demand that Chris mentioned earlier. And I see Eleftherios has his hands up.
Eleftherios, if you wanted to respond.
I simply want to add, Doug, to the great points of Chip, the fact that our economies are integrated. So yes, 24 in Europe, in Singapore, in China, this is how the ports have been operating, not in our case. But think about the vessels that are stuck, that Chris spoke about, for 2 or 3 weeks outside waiting for service, right? These vessels, these containers are outside of the effective capacity that could serve, that could be utilized for export from China, right? So the ripple effects are amazing. At the same time, the market, as Chip said, stratifies. So if you and I, Doug, want to export something out of South Korea or Taiwan, the cost of the container will be much more than the 14 or 50,000 that it will cost to ship out of China. Ocean carriers call the shots today. So they're going to go and serve only the most profitable routes, which is China, West, United States. So the system ripple effects are amazing, right? Yes, Chip mentioned how the giants are doing well because they planned in advance and they had the capability to reserve capacity in the ocean carriers. And some of them, Doug, by the way, Chip, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mentioned IKEA here and Walmart, they even hired their own vessels for the first time, smaller feeder ships, right? Which is unthinkable. We go back, Doug, to the beginning of the 20th century to Henry Ford's vertical model, right? To protect ourselves against risks. So while the giants have done well, the small and medium enterprises are suffering because they don't have the leverage to get themselves into this saturated capacity. And I don't want to take too much time because I know Chris wants to talk.
Absolutely. Chris, you wanted to respond as well.
Thank you. I really fully agree what Eleftherios was saying in terms of the changes. Now, I just want to think about, come back to Chip's point earlier. I think the government right now is focusing on taking care of the supply chain issues now. But the port issues will subside. So don't worry about it. I think it will take some time. I predict that by the middle of next year, it will clear the backlog because Americans run out of money to buy more things. Okay. So when the demand subsides, then it will be fine. But then the question is that I learned from Churchill, never let a crisis go to waste. So what we learn from this is really a learning lesson for the American public. We need to rethink about how we can actually secure our supply chain. Now, given US, the wage cost is too high, but we can compete on speed. So now I think that maybe it's time to leverage the NAFTA Part 2, the USMCA agreements that were signed last year. And I think that's right now, actually, in Mexico, they do have ports, but they need some upgrades in terms of infrastructure. So one of the port is quite big. It's called Lázaro Cárdenas. It's near in the Michoacán state. And you can actually have the railroad already set up to take it across to Veracruz or Tampico, and then you can go into Texas, right? So that would save up a lot of money. So I talked with the CEO of a railroad track. They said that if it's done well, it's cheaper than actually getting the container to Long Beach all the way to Houston. He said we can do it cheaper. So that's point number one. Point number two is that the Mexico wages is still cheaper. If we can leverage that kind of agreement, and also we can also benefit our neighbors, then we create win-win-win. So if everybody wins, and actually we don't need to really go that far to source our products. So I think that is a more long-term solution. And I think it's about time to rethink how we actually redesign our supply chain in the long run.
Chip, you wanted to respond?
Well said, Chris and Eleftherios. By the way, if we automate more, that, let's call it automation, whatever it is, machine, robot, or so forth, has the same wage rate in China as it has in the United States. Okay, 0. So I think automation will also tend to level the playing field when it comes to the fundamental reason of low cost of having global supply chains. And actually, going to Chris's point, the wages in Mexico are actually less expensive than wages in China around the water, the big ports now. So Mexico is a great place to put your supply chain. And as a matter of fact, there are companies that use exactly that way of bringing in not durable goods manufacturing, but consumer electronics, bringing them in through the Mexican ports, do their some assembly and then going across the US-Mexican border because it's cheaper for a variety of different reasons, regulatory reasons, as well as just cost reasons. So that's true. The other thing that implicitly Chris pointed to, and Eleftherios has also mentioned, is that we're going to have global supply chains. They just might be shorter to be more resilient and to reduce lead times. As soon as you reduce lead times in a supply chain, it automatically becomes more agile and more resilient. That's a good reason to go back and look at your product design and your supply chain design them concurrently so that you can reduce lead times all over the supply chain. Again, it's a good reason to bring in automation because all of a sudden the wage rate issue becomes a little less concern. A good reason to go to Mexico is because the wages are, again, less expensive than the onshore wage rates in China. So there are long-term, let's call it longer than short-term, solutions that will, actually build in resilience to supply chains, going back to Eleftherios' comment, at low cost. Cost is always going to be a driver, so we need to take that into consideration. And going back to the academics who may come up with some great ideas, or a source of innovation for building in resilience into supply chains and into products that are part of the supply chain at low cost, I think has a good future.
And Chris, we have about 90 seconds left, but I wanted to give you the last word on this question. It sounds like a lot of what's being described is already sort of being done or being planned by industry. Is this really going to be an industry-driven initiative, or do you expect that there's really going to need to be quite a bit of government direction?
That's a good question. Regarding Mexico, and I think that right now there is a private company-driven initiatives. Last week, Canada Pacific just acquired Kansas City Southern. So they have the Canadian railroad network get across the border all the way to the south to Texas and then cross all the way to Mexico. So I think that in the future, this Canada Pacific will connect Mexico, US, and Canada. Now, how to leverage this network, I do not know. Now, but for the ports in Mexico, the government is a landlord. So I think that some government also need to work partners with the private companies. As I said before, I think that if truly the three governments can really take the initiative to work together to create a win-win-win situation, I think that would be a more sustainable supply chain. Bear in mind, Canada is actually suffering from supply chain disruption as well, because the major ports in Canada is Vancouver, British Columbia. Because of the flood, the railroad is not working, and also the highway is not working. So now they have to actually rely on Montana to ship across the border. So I was on the Canada National Radio to talk about these issues. So even Canada has the supply chain issues, and then Mexico with all this. So why not work together as neighbors so everyone is more secure? So I think it's doable. If there's a will, there's a way.
This has been a remarkable conversation. I've learned, quite a bit about the supply chain, and certainly I think if nothing else, the lesson here is the need for government officials to understand the supply chain a bit more and to have much deeper conversations, because at the end of the day, this is not just necessarily a response to the pandemic, but some much larger issues. And the supply chain disruptions have certainly exposed those issues. Our panel today has been Christopher Tang, distinguished professor and the Edward W. Carter Chair in Business Administration and Senior Associate Dean of Global Initiatives at UCLA. He's the co-author of Supply Chain Risk Management and the co-editor of Operations Management Models with Consumer-Driven Demand. Eleftherios Iakovou the Harvey Hubble Professor of Industrial Distribution at Texas A&M University and the Director of Manufacturing and Logistics Innovation Initiatives at the Texas A&M Engineering Experiment Station. He's the co-author of Sustainable Supply Chain Management in the Digitalization Era, the Impact of Automated Guided Vehicles, and with Chelsea White, the co-author of How to Build More Secure, Resilient, Next Generation U.S. Supply Chain. And Chelsea White, the Schneider National Chair in Transportation and Logistics and professor at the H. Milton Stewart School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech. He's also the co-author of Mobile Access Hub Deployment for Urban Parcel Logistics and how to build a more secure, resilient, next-gen U.S. supply chain with Eleftherios Iakovou. Thank you all very, very much for your insights. We very much appreciate the conversation.
And that's it for today's program. Thank you for listening. The Scholar Circle is hosted by Doug Becker. Its managing producers are Ankina Agassian and Melissa Chiprin. Sed Dongre is our webmaster and assistant producer. Our archives are at scholarcircle.org, and our podcasts are on Apple and Google Podcasts and iTunes. Please follow us on @ScholarCircle or me @Armudian and join our Facebook page. I'm the founder, anchor, and occasional host, Maria Armudian.